Hello, I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of Dr. Edgar Blackburn, a scientist who sought to save humanity in an incredibly inhumane manner. Our first interaction with Dr. Blackburn takes place shortly after the Brotherhood of Steel Expeditionary Force arrived in Appalachia in 2103. When attempting to gain entry to Fort Atlas for the first time, Knight Shin tasks us with interviewing a quartet of visitors that have arrived seeking an audience with the Brotherhood of Steel. Among these visitors is a bespectacled, lab coat-clad scientist with a buzz cut and a bit of an attitude. After we point out his mildly antagonistic behavior, he becomes more courteous, and he tells us that he came to Fort Atlas because he heard that the Brotherhood is in possession of high-tech equipment, and he wanted to see if he could get his hands on some. In further questioning, he relates his interest in the health of the people of Appalachia, stating that they have relied on folk remedies and makeshift medicines for too long. Further, he expresses concern about the fact that everyone is living in a world where radiation levels are livable but still unsafe. He tells us that he believes that someday all of Appalachia will benefit from his research. In the end, he leaves empty-handed, relating that it appears that others are in more need of assistance from the Brotherhood than he. For a time, this was the only interaction that we had with the Doctor, as we turned our attention to helping the newly arrived Brotherhood establish a foothold in the region. It wouldn't be until the next year that we would meet again, arresting him at gunpoint for the deaths of hundreds of wastelanders. Let's look into Dr. Blackburn's past and get a better idea of the man who wanted to save humanity and ended up as a literal as well as figurative monster. In the years before the bombs, Dr. Blackburn was a research scientist and professor working to gain tenure, seeing the world outside the university labs descending into ruin with riots and food shortages. He couldn't justify doing nothing to help. When approached by West Tech to work on the Greenhouse Initiative, it seemed like a perfect match. The Greenhouse Initiative was West Tech's division set up in Appalachia to genetically engineer food crops using the pan-immunity variant with the goal of feeding the hungry public. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Dr. Blackburn to use his skills to help his fellow man. Unfortunately for the Doctor, the Greenhouse Initiative was cancelled before he could even start the job offered him. This was due to the shifting priorities with the Pan-Immunity Variant Project. The PvP had been created as a means to end contagious disease forever. But a West Tech lab in California had discovered that animal specimens exposed to the variant were made stronger, larger, and immune to radiation. Thus, they changed the PvP to the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project and changed the focus to making super soldiers. Plant tests were cancelled, leaving Blackburn on the sidelines. His would-be boss, Dr. Wilfred Dumont, worked to find new jobs for his now out-of-work staff. When Dr. Dumont found a role for Dr. Blackburn in the FEV project, he was hesitant, but Dr. Dumont begged him to stay, promising work both vital and challenging. Though he would come to regret it, he agreed to join the FEV research team. His experience at West Tech Huntersville would be the most formative of his life. It was there that he witnessed the power of FEV in rewriting the genetic structure of humanity, and how this power could be mismanaged by incompetent leadership. The programs in Huntersville were under the direction of Dr. Elias Kahn, a scientist for whom Dr. Blackburn had little respect. Dr. Kahn authorized the creation of monstrosities such as the Snallygaster and the Grafton Monster. He oversaw the distribution of FEV into the water supply of Huntersville. There was no benefit to be had from these experiments. As Dr. Blackburn notes, they already knew what FEV did to humans after the first few tests. Why infect an entire town, dooming the inhabitants to needless suffering and death? Because they could. As Blackburn states, these scientists didn't do these things to create a cure for FEV or to rework the strain to make healthier humans. They were like kids with a magnifying glass burning ants. They had the ultimate power over their test subjects, and they submitted them to horrific experiments for no reason. The closest we can get to actual research is the Advanced Mutations program that sought to create new organisms using different strains of FEV. But given the results of this research, the project hardly seems beneficial to humanity. It was at West Tech that Dr. Blackburn also reunited with a junior scientist named Dr. Jane, who shared his disgust of the direction of the FEV project. Drs. Blackburn and Jane had worked at the same university before being recruited to West Tech. After the bombs fell, Dr. Blackburn fled Appalachia, bitter about his failure to help humanity and ashamed for having stayed on the staff at West Tech when it was clear that the work was pointless and evil. It would be many years before he worked up the courage to return to Appalachia. Dr. Blackburn witnessed the complete collapse of the pre-war society and all that brought with it. The world was more dangerous than ever before, not just because of the raiders and the horrible creatures that wandered the wasteland, creatures he blamed himself for, but because of the elevated background radiation levels and new diseases that had arisen. There was no longer a medical establishment to treat illnesses or to produce new drugs to help people. Instead, Wastelanders created home remedies with varying rates of efficacy. Just as he had wanted to help fix the food shortages before the bombs, he knew he possessed the capacity to help, and he couldn't just sit around watching the world suffer. He wanted to reverse the mistakes of Westech. He knew that though FEV converted the physical form of people into supermutants, and caused damage to their intellectual capacity, it also rendered them immune to radiation and disease, two of the biggest killers in the post-war world. If he could revise the form of the FEV, he knew that he could fix the issues that Dr. Khan had ignored. He could make the FEV live up to its name, forcing the evolution of humanity such that it could survive in the world that had been created by the bombs. He knew that with his efforts, FEV could save humanity without turning them into monsters. Thus, he returned to Appalachia. In order to execute his plans, Dr. Blackburn would need access to FEV and a safe laboratory capable of the manipulation of FEV. Beyond this, he would need live test subjects and a way to hold them and observe the effects of the experiments on them. Westech Huntersville would be an obvious spot to do this work. After all, this is where the misuse of FEV had begun. Unfortunately, the site was overrun by super mutants. While Dr. Blackburn's colleagues in the decontamination lab had produced a decontaminant that was used to neutralize the FEV vats before the staff abandoned the building, the Enclave had reactivated the site and super mutants were out in force. In a pair of monumental strokes of luck, Blackburn both discovered Vault 96 and found that its door could be opened without issue. Vault 96, having been designed to create genetic mutation serums, had everything he needed. The equipment, the materials, the cells to hold subjects, an automated research system, and bays of animal test subjects held in cryogenic storage. He could even seal the door for security. In an odd twist of fate, of the 4 test chambers, Chamber 3 contained a snallygaster, one of the 2 viable species created by the Advanced Mutations program at his old workplace. He decided to leave it be for the time being. In a further stroke of luck for Blackburn, the Vault's previous staff had used a virus to kill some hostile programming on the mainframe that left the Vault safe for him, even if it had unfortunately killed them in the process. Though there was an excess of ice throughout the Vault, another relic of the previous occupants, Dr. Blackburn would also eventually turn it to his advantage. While he didn't believe in predestination, the Vault seemed like a perfect fit. As the work began, Dr. Blackburn began to utilize the remaining animals in cryostorage for his tests, making use of the Vault's automated research systems. He also made contact with an old colleague from the university, Dr. Farha. He asked Dr. Farha to join his project, but when he explained the issues he expected to run into, specifically the failures, she was hesitant to get on board. Back at the university, they had clashed on ethical issues, and she was concerned about the potential ramifications of the idea. The young woman she was tutoring, Nellie Wright, ended up getting involved. Dr. Farah had caught Nellie in her home after she had broken in searching for food, and ended up being fascinated by Dr. Farah's research. From that point, Dr. Farha taught Nellie everything she knew. Nellie was incredibly excited by Dr. Blackburn's idea, and she pushed Dr. Farha to join the project. Dr. Farha also contacted Dr. Jane, Blackburn's old co-worker at the university and at Westech, who was also excited by Dr. Blackburn's proposal. The combined pressure of Nellie and Dr. Jane convinced the reluctant Dr. Farha to join the team, bringing Nellie and Jane on board as well. This new team would work in 2 locations. Dr. Blackburn would maintain his post at Vault 96, while the other trio would prepare for the mass production of Blackburn's perfected FEV. This site for mass production was the FEV Production Center under Westech Huntersville. This was likely the first time that Blackburn's associates would hire the Hellcat mercenaries for security, beginning a relationship that would last until 2104. With the help of the Hellcats, Dr. Farha's team accessed the mass production lab and started their work there. They would get the site ready for mass production, but they would also assist Dr. Blackburn with computer models to hopefully guide his work towards the right strain. Back in Vault 96, Blackburn was running out of animal test subjects, the vast majority having been used up by the prior occupants. Besides the impending shortage, animal testing wasn't the most effective way to test the new strains that were meant to create improved humans. He would obviously need human test subjects. He didn't believe that he could obtain voluntary test subjects for his work, and thus the kidnapping began. This work started off small, kidnapping those that needed medical help and thought he, a doctor, could help. Unfortunately for them, he wasn't that kind of doctor. His conscience bothered him with these tests, but he pushed it aside. He was doing this for the greater good, he told himself. What does it matter if a few die to save millions? Dr. Blackburn began to travel via the Blue Ridge Caravan to find test subjects, kidnapping one at a time for his project. He would bring these subjects back, inject them with the newest strain, and run tests, checking for radiation resistance, electrical impedance, and intelligence retention. If they showed signs they were about to become super mutants, he would dump them out of the vault, not being capable of fighting a fully transformed super mutant. He would then alter the strain and begin the cycle over again. This process would eventually create a new super mutant menace, and a smarter one at that. These are the mutants that would go on to dig into the foundations of the Brotherhood of Steel's Fort Atlas. While he continued this horrible cycle of kidnapping, experimentation, and abandonment or murder, he did continue to suffer attacks of conscience. When one of these test subjects called him out by name, he found it unpleasant and distracting. Dr. Blackburn had given out his real name on his trips with the Blue Ridge Caravan, and there was no taking that back. These tests made slow progress, with some strains gaining ground on his goal, while others would prove useless. The FEV almost seemed to be consciously fighting him, but he persevered. As his serum resulted in test subjects' increased durability, his work became much more fast-paced, and his need for test subjects more intense. He hired the Hellcat mercenaries to assist in kidnapping and security. They didn't know why he was kidnapping people, and they didn't care. They were also willing to do chemical supply runs, another boon to Dr. Blackburn's research. While the guards at the door were welcome, Dr. Blackburn kept the vault's security bots at the ready, knowing that money was the only thing that held those mercs' loyalty. Some of those on whom Dr. Blackburn experimented didn't get to the point of conversion into super mutants, expiring during the tests of their resistances. Bodies were piling up in the vault, an unnerving condition even for a scientist as stoic as Dr. Blackburn. To counter the smell and their close proximity, he began to store them in the damaged cryogenic bays, hoping to use the excess ice to reduce the scent of decay. Sometimes Dr. Blackburn would assist in test subject acquisition, joining a caravan as an inside man. In this role, he and his Hellcat mercenaries kidnapped an entire 14-person caravan for his tests. His research soon moved into drug uptake. He began to believe that it was the directly injecting FEV into the bloodstream that was causing the metamorphosis as a reaction of the immune system to the sudden bulk delivery of virus. To test this, he began to add FEV to the water, food, and air supply of his prisoners. As test results improved, he began working to make the FEV confer the proper degree of disease resistance. As he neared his goal of completing the perfect FEV strain, his conscience was truly catching up to him. He believed in his work absolutely, but he couldn't stand the stares and the weeping of his test subjects. He wondered if these people would haunt him in his dreams, or if he would be caught and granted the release of death. The goal that he had started with many months before was all that kept him going when he faced the endless tide of successful failures. Then it happened. He finally had the perfect strain, the form of FEV that would transform humans into a species capable of living in the new world. They would be immune to radiation and disease, with insulating skin incapable of conducting deadly currents of electricity. The monstrous acts he had undertaken would surely bring him scorn, but Dr. Edgar Blackburn would be remembered as the savior of humanity. A monster, but one that would be universally respected for the innumerable lives that he saved, even with all the lives that were lost. At least this was his hope. As he prepared to test this perfect strain, explosions rang out from the entry hall. From his perch, he saw Blood Eagle raiders pouring into the atrium. The vault had been so far out of the way that the Hellcats guarding the entrance were caught completely by surprise when a handful of grenades flew through the vault door. The Blood Eagles couldn't access the Overseer's office, but they were moving throughout the vault looking for loot. Blackburn transmitted the last of the plans for the FEV strain to Westtech and Dr. Farhaw's team, sealing the Blood Eagles in and sending the vault's security robots after them. That's when two members of the Brotherhood of Steel hacked their way into the vault. Scribe Odessa Valdez and a former vault dweller of Vault 76 turned highly esteemed initiate. The Brotherhood fought their way through the vault, killing the Blood Eagles, uncovering the rooms full of bodies of Dr. Blackburn's test subjects, and freeing the remaining members of the Blue Ridge caravan of 14 that he had kidnapped. This wasn't the rescue he may have hoped for. The Brotherhood had been on his trail since the more strategically minded super mutants had burrowed into Fort Atlas. An investigation of the Hellcats and the Blue Ridge caravan revealed Dr. Blackburn to be behind the disappearances of hundreds of the residents of Appalachia. When they broke into his office, he surrendered without resistance, answering their questions courteously before being taken into custody. He told them that he knew what he had done and how he would be judged, but that he had done it all for humanity. Further, he told them that they couldn't stop him. His plan was already in motion. Upon the arrival of a larger Brotherhood escort team, he was taken back to Fort Atlas for interrogation. Upon arrival at Fort Atlas, Dr. Blackburn was indeed interrogated by the expedition's leaders, Paladin Romani, Knight Shin, and Scribe Valdez. Speaking calmly and politely, Dr. Blackburn explained his actions. He told them that what he had done was terrible and he would have to live with those wrongs, but that the end justifies the means. While Knight Shin demanded Dr. Blackburn's immediate execution for the deaths of so many, Paladin Romani kept the Knight at bay, hoping to extract more information. Acting again in full cooperation, Dr. Blackburn explained that his fellows, Dr. Farha, Dr. Jane, and Nellie Wright, were preparing to distribute the perfected strain of FEV into the air and water supply. Horrified by this revelation, and believing that he might come in handy in a negotiation with these scientists, Paladin Romani, Knight Shin, Dr. Blackburn, and the initiate that had arrested him departed for West Tech. After the initiate cleared the Hellcat mercenary guards, the Brotherhood and Blackburn followed, descending into the FEV production facility beneath. After a brief exchange regarding what lay ahead, they continued on until they encountered Dr. Farha's team. Dr. Blackburn explained the basics of the situation, namely that he was the Brotherhood's captive and that the Brotherhood wanted the plan stopped immediately, leaving the Brotherhood to attempt to talk the distribution team down. It soon became clear that negotiations wouldn't move forward as long as the Brotherhood held Dr. Blackburn captive. An issue further complicated by Dr. Blackburn revealing that he had password locked the distribution process, so the current course couldn't be altered even if the team did agree to stop. With no other non-violent means past the impasse, the Brotherhood released Blackburn back to his colleagues, whereupon he immediately betrayed the trust of the Brotherhood. He ordered Nellie to prep the test chamber, arguing that a successful trial of his perfected FEV would allay any fears and pave the path to distribution. He descended into the test chamber, pursued by the Brotherhood. As the test began, it rapidly became clear that things were not going according to plan. The models were wrong. Blackburn was wrong. Converted into a hulking super mutant, Dr. Blackburn broke the containment of the equipment and attempted to slaughter the Brotherhood team. Though more intelligent and far larger than a normal super mutant, he had become an inhuman monster with murder in mind. After a raging battle, Dr. Blackburn fell to the combined arms of the Paladin, the Knight, and the Initiate. His colleagues were immediately arrested and interrogated. Dr. Farha explained that they truly had hoped to, quote, give humanity a better way to fight back against the radiation, the mutants, the decay of civilization, end quote. But spared execution, they could do so much good. Dr. Jane had similar sentiments. They had hoped to better humankind. Nellie Wright was unapologetic. They had been close to providing the world with something amazing. Given more time, they would finish it. When pressed further, Dr. Jane said that they were working for the greater good, and that he thought that the human test subjects were volunteers, that he didn't know that Blackburn was kidnapping them until later on. Given the opportunity, he wants to continue the FEV experiments with animal testing and better controls. He believes that they were very close to finding the last issues with the strain, and that ending the experiments now would mean the sacrifice of so many lives for nothing. Turning to Dr. Farha, she explains that they could work on mutation serums, something that already exists in the wasteland. She believes that the experiments went too far, claiming that she didn't know that Blackburn was experimenting on humans until she'd already brought Dr. Jane and Nellie Wright on board. She says that she stayed on to try to prevent the unnecessary loss of human life. Lastly, Nellie Wright speaks to us in a very informal manner, showing a basic disinterest in the ongoing events. She believed fully in Dr. Blackburn's idea, complaining that the computer models showed that the perfected FEV would work, and that she knows where they would need to fix it. She shows no remorse for the deaths of the many wastelanders who lost their lives in the process. She explains that yes, they kidnapped and experimented on people, but that's not worse than the outcome of most kidnappings. The people who died should have been happy to contribute to their project, claiming that she would have been. The outcome of this overall conversation results in either the execution of the scientists or their conscription into the Brotherhood of Steel as wards of Scribe Valdez. In the larger scheme of things, this results in a schism in the Brotherhood, with either Knight Shin taking charge, or Paladin Romani remaining in charge of the Appalachian chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel. We don't yet know the canonical ending of this, but we have, for now, reached the end of the story of Dr. Edgar Blackburn. Alright, I've got some conclusions on Dr. Blackburn and a few thoughts on the rest of the events that surround him. I'll start with my thoughts on Dr. Blackburn himself. Dr. Blackburn was a man of science, with an indomitable will and a vision of a better future he could create for humanity. His will made him capable of doing terrible things if he believed that it would lead to the manifestation of this vision. In spite of all of the death that he caused in the search for his perfect strain of FEV, it appears that he detested needless suffering, and those that caused it, such as his old boss, Elias Khan. He knew that humanity would view him as a monster, but he also knew that they would live longer, healthier, better lives if he succeeded. And that was a trade he was willing to make. In the end, he was even willing to risk his own life if it meant that he might save humanity. While all of this might be true, Dr. Blackburn was a monster, and he was a monster long before he became one literally. When this all began, Dr. Blackburn was a university professor and researcher who left his career behind because he couldn't see how it was benefiting a rapidly collapsing society. When he joined West Tech, he did so because he believed he could help society with genetically modified crops that would resist droughts, pests, and grow more food to feed the starving masses. His trip towards revealing the monster within began when the Greenhouse Initiative closed, and he chose to remain on with West Tech and the FEV program. As soon as he knew that they were dosing the unsuspecting people of Huntersville with a mutagenic virus, and he did nothing, he took the first steps down that path. I can even understand not being a whistleblower in this situation. West Tech's actions were classified to such an extreme level that even the local intelligence base at Sugar Grove didn't have insight into their actions. If he had attempted to raise the alarm about what was happening in Huntersville, he would have likely been killed or at the very least shuffled off to prison. Not everyone has the courage to stand up to that kind of threat, but continuing to aid West Tech's actions in Huntersville is inexcusable. The terrible thing about this is I fully believe that if Dr. Blackburn was in charge, he would have performed his own experiments on the people, simply doing so without the pointless suffering incurred by Dr. Khan. He would have used the people of Huntersville in his experiments to create a perfect strain of FEV. He believed in using FEV to improve humanity, and had he had the full breadth of West Tech's logistical support, he may well have succeeded. His colleagues were preparing to dose the whole of Appalachia with an untested, improperly sequenced virus that would have killed or transformed the masses. The issue is that even if they had succeeded in creating the perfect strain, it's not their right to force evolutionary change on all of humanity without the people getting a say-so in what happens to them. Beyond the issue of this choice, we get to the basic question of safety. FEV was responsible for the death and mutation of hundreds of people in Dr. Blackburn's trials. In this process, Dr. Blackburn viewed the FEV as a living entity that he was forcing into shape, describing it as fighting him like an animal backed into a corner. What's to say that the virus wouldn't mutate on its own and revert to the super mutant-causing form of the virus in the completely uncontrolled environment outside? Beyond this, there are entire avenues of research that haven't been fully explored, e.g., what are the long-term effects of this? Is the metamorphosis truly removed, or has it simply been postponed? And what happens if it sterilizes the users? The FEV we're used to is known to render the patient sterile. I have to seriously question if this was ever tested by Blackburn. In closing on Blackburn himself, I think he's a tremendously interesting character and a great villain. A monster in a lab coat that serves as the perfect representation of the old line, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." Alright, on to the other things I mentioned earlier. First of all, I think that Doctors Jane and Farha are both lying to us in the final interrogation. Not about everything, but as to their knowledge of the tests on kidnapped human subjects. According to Dr. Blackburn's logs, when he first sought to recruit Dr. Farha, he says, quote, "Dr. Farha was reluctant when I first described my aims, the testing that would be required, and the failures gave her pause." End quote. This implies to me that she knew that the program involved human testing from very early on. I think we see in Dr. Farha someone with a bright mind, but also someone who has trouble standing up for herself. While she recruited Dr. Jane and her assistant Nellie to the project in the first place, when her moral compass tells her how unethical the operation is, she falls to their peer pressure and stays on the project. While she tells us that she stayed on to save even one person, this is an obvious excuse. She never had any direct contact with the human testing side of things. How was she going to do anything to stop the sacrifice of a single individual? That being said, I think she did have legitimate ethical issues with the research, as she's the only one of the trio that wants to jump off onto a different project. As for Dr. Jane, when he says that he believed that the subjects were willing participants, this seems to me to be an obvious attempt at covering himself. Dr. Blackburn never attempted to recruit a single test subject, viewing it as an impossibility. While he might have lied to the rest of the team, Dr. Jane isn't an idiot. He knew what the tests entailed. It's hard for me to believe that he didn't know what Blackburn was doing. On to more minor things. First, when Dr. Farha tells us that she and Dr. Blackburn and Dr. Jane all worked together at the university, but that Blackburn and Jane didn't know each other then, this is incorrect. In Dr. Blackburn's holotape FEV research number 17, he says, quote, "Farha has brought in Jane. I knew him from university and our time at West Tech." End quote. Not a big thing, just an incorrect statement. Second, Nellie Wright is easily the most dangerous of the scientists remaining, if they survive the potential purge. Nellie is completely unrepentant about all that the team did and is hungering to get back on the project. Given the chance, she would continue Dr. Blackburn's work without a second thought. And another little tiny note, she would definitely be happier as Dr. Blackburn's assistant than she is as Dr. Farha's. Third, I had to kind of guess on the science team's first interaction with the Hellcat mercenary group. This is because Dr. Blackburn claims in FEV Research Log number 17 that, quote, Dr. Farha meanwhile has established a laboratory suitable for mass production, end quote. To operate this mass production lab beneath the West Tech facility, they would have needed guards to get in, and in the end they had Hellcat mercs guarding the site. The issue with this is it's not until the holotape FEV Research Log number 112 that Dr. Blackburn first mentions the Hellcats, describing himself as hiring them for acquisition work. Maybe they hired two different groups, one for taking the lab and then they hired the Hellcats to guard it later, or maybe they never discussed mercenary hiring between themselves. I'm not sure. Regardless, I hope that you understand why I discussed it as though they had hired the Hellcats to seize the lab. Fourth, I don't understand how they hired the Hellcats. They hired a lot of people. It cannot have been cheap to hire that many mercs. How did they afford it? I know Dr. Blackburn promised that they could scavenge Vault 96 when the time came, but how can that have been enough to get them as much support as it did? It just seems odd that they could afford as many Hellcats as they did. Lastly, I want to recognize Dr. Blackburn's voice actor, Keith Sarabaika, if I'm pronouncing that right, for his excellent performance here. He's a great actor and voice actor who also voiced Joshua Graham, the Burned Man, in Fallout New Vegas, along with a few other characters in Fallout 4, not to mention many other games and movies. In particular, I'm always going to remember his performance as your partner on the Arson Squad in LA Noire. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about Dr. Edgar Blackburn. If you want to get notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me at Gaming with Maps on Twitter. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron on Patreon. To that end, I want to thank my patrons, Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, and Jill AWS for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.